The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sparse New Mexican landscape. In the midst of this desolate beauty stood an isolated trailer home, miles away from the nearest neighbor. The fading light painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a picturesque scene starkly contrasted by the creeping sense of solitude. Inside the trailer, Jake, a 16-year-old with a lean build and curious eyes, moved about with an uneasy sense of freedom. His parents had left earlier that day, trusting him to look after the house while they attended a family emergency out of state. It was the first time Jake had been left alone overnight, and the responsibility weighed on him, mixed with a tinge of excitement. The trailer, a cozy if somewhat cramped space, was filled with mementos of a family that cherished simplicity and the outdoors. Pictures of camping trips, fishing excursions, and starry nights adorned the walls. Jake's room, a small but comfortable nook, was cluttered with books about astronomy and wildlife, revealing his passion for the mysteries of the natural world. As night fully embraced the desert, Jake settled into an evening alone. He reheated some of his mom's casserole for dinner, ate in silence, and then decided to watch a movie to pass the time. Outside, the wind began to pick up, its howls weaving through the trailer's thin walls, adding an eerie soundtrack to his solitary night. Halfway through the movie, Jake paused, thinking he heard a whisper carried by the wind. He muted the TV and listened intently, but it was just the rustling of leaves. Chalking it up to his imagination, he unpaused the movie, trying to focus on the screen. Yet, as the night progressed, the sense of isolation grew more profound. The vast expanse of the desert, usually a comforting constant in Jake's life, now felt like an unending void, filled with unknowns. Little did he know that his sense of fear was not misplaced, and that this night would be unlike any other. The clock ticked past midnight, and the desert's nocturnal chorus rose in a symphony of distant howls and rustling. Jake, now feeling the weight of the solitude, turned off the TV, unable to shake off a growing sense of unease. He decided to prepare for bed, hoping sleep would grant him respite from the eerie silence that had enveloped his home. As he brushed his teeth, Jake's mind replayed the day's events, the mundane normality of it all. But tonight, the normal felt overshadowed by something he couldn't quite place. A feeling, a whisper of something otherworldly, lurking just beyond the reach of his understanding. Climbing into bed, he pulled the covers tight, the chill of the desert night seeping through the trailer's thin walls. Just as he began to drift off, a faint scratching sound echoed from the living room. Jake's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. He lay still, straining his ears. There it was again, a soft, deliberate scratching like nails on metal. Summoning his courage, Jake crept out of bed and tiptoed to the living room. The moonlight cast a ghostly glow through the windows, but nothing seemed amiss. He stood there for a moment listening, but the sound had ceased. Shaking his head, he convinced himself it was just a branch or some small animal outside. Returning to bed, Jake's mind was a whirl of thoughts. He tried to rationalize his fears, attributing them to the movies he'd watched and his overactive imagination. But deep down, a primal part of him whispered warnings of unseen dangers lurking in the dark. As the hours crawled by, the trailer seemed to creak and groan more than usual, each noise amplifying Jake's fear. He tossed and turned, unable to find the comfort of sleep. Then, just as he was about to drift off, a sudden thud against the window jolted him awake. His heart pounded in his chest as he lay frozen, too scared to move. After what felt like an eternity, Jake mustered enough bravery to peek through the curtains. Outside, the moonlit desert stretched endlessly, its beauty now twisted into a haunting landscape. There was nothing there, no sign of what could have caused the noise. He tried to convince himself it was just a bird or a bat, anything to explain away the fear gnawing at his sanity. Yet, as he crawled back into bed, a chilling sensation washed over him, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He glanced around the dimly lit room, half expecting to see a figure looming in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the familiar objects of his home bathed in the ghostly moonlight. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-sleep and startling noises. Jake was caught in a limbo of fear and exhaustion, every creak and whisper a potential harbinger of something sinister. As dawn approached, bringing with it the first light of day, Jake realized this night was far from over. The events that had unfolded were only the beginning of a terrifying ordeal that would challenge his understanding of reality. As the first light of dawn began to break, Jake felt a wave of relief. The night had been long and fraught with inexplicable noises and a persistent feeling of dread. He had hoped the daylight would dispel his fears, but the events of the night lingered in his mind like a bad dream. Exhausted, Jake decided to make some coffee and try to shake off the remnants of fear. The trailer felt different in the light of day, less menacing, but the memories of the night's terrors were still fresh. As he sipped his coffee, he couldn't help but glance nervously at the windows, half expecting to see something peering back at him. Trying to distract himself, Jake turned on the TV, only to find that the reception was unusually poor. Frustrated, he flicked it off and decided to get some fresh air. He stepped outside, the cool morning breeze a welcome contrast to the stuffy interior of the trailer. The desert, now bathed in the soft light of dawn, seemed peaceful, its earlier malevolence forgotten. But as he walked around the trailer, his foot kicked something small and hard. Bending down, he picked up a small, oddly shaped stone, its surface smooth and almost glass-like. It was unlike any rock he had seen in the desert before. Puzzled, he pocketed the stone and continued his walk. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. He had the unmistakable sensation that he was being watched. He quickly scanned his surroundings, but there was nothing, just the endless expanse of the desert. Shaking off the feeling, he headed back inside, uneasy. Once inside, Jake tried to focus on his usual weekend chores, but his mind kept drifting back to the previous night and the odd stone he had found. Deciding to investigate further, he took the stone to his room and examined it under his desk lamp. It was then that he noticed it wasn't just a stone. It had a faint, almost imperceptible glow. Intrigued and a bit unnerved, Jake placed the stone on his desk and tried to research similar phenomena online. But before he could delve deeper, a sudden blackout plunged the trailer into darkness. Startled, Jake fumbled for his flashlight, his heart racing. As he switched it on, he caught a glimpse of something moving outside the window. Panicked, he ducked down and crawled to the window, peering out cautiously. What he saw made his blood run cold. Shadows were moving around the trailer, not like those cast by trees or animals, but as if they had a life of their own. They swirled and twisted in unnatural ways, occasionally pressing up against the glass before receding into the murky depths of the desert. Terrified, Jake backed away from the window, unsure of what to do. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Were these the creatures that had tormented him all night? Were they drawn to the stone? The questions swirled in his head, each more frightening than the last. He spent the next few hours huddled in the corner of his room, flashlight in hand, jumping at every sound. The shadows continued their eerie dance outside, occasionally tapping against the windows, as if testing the barriers between them and Jake. As the day wore on, the intensity of the encounters grew. The shadows seemed to become more aggressive, more tangible. Jake, paralyzed by fear, felt a growing sense of despair. He was trapped, alone, with no one to turn to, and no way to escape. The sun began to set, and with it, Jake's hopes of the shadows disappearing with the daylight faded. Night was approaching, and with it, an unknown and terrifying ordeal. Jake realized he had to make a decision: to confront whatever was outside or to remain a prisoner in his own home. The sun had set, and darkness enveloped the desert once again. Jake, still huddled in his room, felt the oppressive weight of fear as the shadows outside grew bolder. The soft glow of his flashlight did little to comfort him, its beams seeming to be swallowed by the thickening darkness outside. The tapping against the windows became more frequent, more insistent. Jake tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was just the wind or some desert animal. But deep down, he knew it was something far more sinister. The air inside the trailer felt charged, heavy with an unspoken menace. In a fleeting moment of bravery, Jake turned off his flashlight and peered through the window into the night. His heart skipped a beat when he saw them, figures barely discernible, moving with an unnatural fluidity. They seemed to be circling the trailer, coming closer with each pass. Suddenly, a loud bang against the side of the trailer jolted Jake back from the window. He stumbled and fell, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The noise was followed by a series of thuds, as if something or multiple somethings were trying to break in. Frozen with terror, Jake crawled to the farthest corner of his room, trying to make himself as small as possible. The noises continued, growing in intensity, a cacophony of bumps, scratches, and eerie whispers that seemed to speak directly to his soul. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the cacophony of moments before. Jake held his breath, waiting, dreading what might come next. It was then that he saw it, a face at the window, not human, but something else, something otherworldly. Its eyes were dark voids, its skin a mottled, shifting mass. Jake screamed a raw, primal sound and scrambled away from the window. He cowered in the corner, his mind reeling. What were these things? Why were they tormenting him? He thought about the stone he had found, the strange glow it emitted. Could it be connected to these creatures? As these thoughts raced through his mind, the trailer suddenly shook violently, as if gripped by an unseen force. Jake screamed again, covering his head with his arms, expecting the walls to cave in at any moment. But just as quickly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. Jake cautiously looked up, his eyes wide with fear. The trailer was intact, but the air felt different, electric. He knew, without knowing how, that the night was far from over. For hours, Jake waited in terror, jumping at every sound, every creak of the trailer. The creatures outside seemed to be playing a game with him, a game of fear and madness. He felt his sanity slipping, his mind fraying at the edges. As the night stretched on, Jake realized he couldn't endure much more. He had to do something, anything, to escape this nightmare. Gathering the last vestiges of his courage, he made a decision that would change the course of the night and his life forever. The night seemed endless, a cycle of terror that ebbed and flowed with the shadows outside Jake's trailer. But as the hours dragged on, a change occurred in him. The fear, while still present, began to be overshadowed by a growing sense of determination. He couldn't spend his life cowering in the corner. He had to face whatever was tormenting him. His mind went back to the strange stone he had found. It seemed to be the catalyst for these events, a key of some sort. With shaky hands, Jake picked up the stone, which now glowed more brightly than before. It was warm to the touch, almost vibrating with an energy he couldn't understand. Taking a deep breath, Jake made a decision. He would go outside. He would confront these creatures, demand answers, or at least drive them away. It was a dangerous plan, perhaps foolish, but he couldn't bear the suspense any longer. He opened the trailer door, the cool night air hitting his face. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the desert. The shadows were there, swirling and moving in the darkness. Jake stepped out, stone in hand, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, the creatures seemed taken aback by his presence. They paused in their movements, and the night grew quiet save for the sound of Jake's breathing. Then slowly, they began to converge on him, closing in from all sides. Jake held up the stone, and to his amazement, the creatures recoiled as if burned. The stone pulsed with light, growing brighter with each step he took. He felt a surge of power, an energy flowing through him, emanating from the stone. With newfound confidence, Jake walked forward, pushing the creatures back. They wailed and hissed, a cacophony of sounds that were both terrifying and pitiful. As he approached the edge of the property, the creatures began to dissipate, like mist in the morning sun. But just as victory seemed within reach, the largest of the creatures emerged from the darkness. It was a monstrous thing towering over Jake, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. Jake could feel its hatred, its desire to overpower him. The creature lunged, and Jake raised the stone in defense. A blinding light erupted from the stone, engulfing both Jake and the creature. He felt as if he were being torn apart, his very essence stretched to its limits. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, and Jake found himself alone. The creatures were gone, vanished into the night. He stood there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. The stone, now dim and lifeless, slipped from his hand and fell to the ground. Exhausted, both physically and mentally, Jake stumbled back to the trailer. He didn't understand what had happened, what those creatures were, or why the stone had the power to drive them away. But for now, it didn't matter. They were gone, and he was safe. As the first light of dawn approached, Jake felt a sense of relief mixed with an overwhelming tiredness. He had faced his fears, confronted the unknown, and somehow he had survived. The morning sun rose over the New Mexico desert, casting a warm glow over the landscape that had been a stage for unspeakable terror just hours before. Jake, sitting on the steps of the trailer, watched the sunrise with a sense of surreal calm. The events of the night felt like a distant nightmare, yet the evidence was right there in his hands. The now dull stone, lying innocuous and lifeless on the wooden step beside him. He was exhausted, every muscle in his body aching from the tension and fear. But more than the physical exhaustion, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of disorientation. The world he thought he knew, a world governed by logic and natural laws, had been turned upside down. He had encountered creatures that defied explanation, experienced powers that belonged in the realm of fantasy. As he sat there, lost in thought, the sound of a car approaching broke his reverie. Jake looked up to see his parents' car kicking up a cloud of dust as it drove down the dirt road towards the trailer. He stood up, a part of him wanting to run to them, to embrace the normalcy and safety they represented. But he hesitated, unsure of how to explain the unexplainable. His parents, seeing him standing there, rushed out of the car, worry etched on their faces. They had been called back early, uneasy about leaving Jake alone. As they reached him, their expressions changed from concern to confusion. Jake looked different. There was a maturity in his eyes, a weight he carried. The questions came, fast and concerned, but Jake found himself unable to speak. How could he explain what had happened? Would they believe him? The stone, the creatures, the battle. It all seemed so fantastical, so impossible. Instead, he simply hugged them, taking comfort in their presence. Over the next few days, Jake tried to return to his normal routine, but the shadows of the night lingered in his mind. He researched tirelessly, trying to find any reference or explanation for what he had experienced, but found nothing. The stone, now just a rock, offered no clues. The encounter had changed Jake. He was more introspective, more aware of the mysteries that lay hidden in the world. He couldn't shake the feeling that what he had experienced was just the tip of an iceberg, a glimpse into a reality far beyond human understanding. Nights were the hardest. Every shadow, every noise brought back memories of the creatures. He kept the stone close, a reminder and a talisman, but it remained lifeless, its secrets locked away. As time passed, Jake began to accept that some questions had no answers, some mysteries no explanations. He had faced something extraordinary, something beyond the realm of normal human experience. It had left its mark on him, an indelible imprint on his soul. And yet, life went on. Jake continued his studies, his interest in the natural world now tinged with a sense of wonder and a touch of apprehension. He knew the world was more complex, more mysterious than he had ever imagined, but the creatures never returned. The desert, with its endless expanse and ancient secrets, remained silent. The stone, a mute witness to the night of terror, was eventually tucked away, a curious artifact of an unbelievable encounter. Jake often wondered if it was over, if the creatures were truly gone. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he would look out into the darkness of the desert, half expecting to see the shadows moving. But they never did. Whether they had been vanquished or had simply retreated to their mysterious realm, he didn't know. The experience had left him with a profound sense of humility and a deep appreciation for the unknown. He realized that some things were beyond human comprehension, existing in the shadows of reality, glimpsed only by those who ventured too close to the edge. Jake's life continued, marked by a night that would forever remain a haunting memory, a reminder of the mysteries that lurk in the depths of the unknown.